If maybe today's your first time with us, or if you haven't been here in a while, I'll just tell you that this summer we've been going through a series entitled Unexpected Heroes, where we've been looking, doing just sort of character studies week by week of people from the Old Testament that wound up being greatly used by God, that when you look at their story, you go, how in the world did God pick that man or that woman to do something great with them? Because they don't look like the kind of people that we expect to do great things. And it's really been an encouraging study for me, because it's just a reminder that God loves to take broken people like me and you and do things that give Him much glory. And so today we're continuing that. We're going to pick up with a character that I thought I was preaching last Sunday until about an hour or two before we got in here and realized God had a different direction for that. If you weren't here last Sunday, if you want to go back and listen to the archived version, it was a message about reclaiming America, and we just took a little detour on the 4th of July weekend. But today we're back on track. We're going to be looking at one of my favorite characters from the Old Testament, a man by the name of Caleb. That's a name that you always hear in tandem with the name Joshua. Now we're backtracking in time just a little bit. The last several messages in this series have been taken out of the book of Judges, and you know how Judges sort of bridges between the taking of the Holy Land and the time of the kings. Well, now we're going to backtrack just for 1 week and just look at a time during the whole Exodus event. I'll set the stage really quickly for us to just remind you of who Caleb is and where he comes in the story. You'll remember, if you know Old Testament history, that the first character that we did in this study, Jacob, when Jacob's 12 sons and their wives and their kids, Jacob, his kids and his grandkids, when they fled from the Holy Land to escape the famine, and when they went down into Egypt, and Joseph now was the second in command, as the book of Genesis comes to a close, all of the descendants of Abraham through the line of Isaac and Jacob have all gone to Egypt, and at the close of Genesis, that's where all 70 of them are living. Well, about 400 years passed between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus, and those 70 people have multiplied like bunny rabbits, and they have grown into a nation of, we're not sure of exactly how many, estimates are between 800,000 and 2 million people who are now living not as guests in Egypt, but they have become slaves in Egypt. And so the book of Exodus begins with the plight of God's people. They're not in the land that God had promised for them, and they're not living a life of abundance. It's a life of oppression. And so you remember how God raised up a deliverer, Moses. He is the great figure of the entire Old Testament. He towers above everyone else. And so when you think the Exodus story, we're always thinking about Moses, and if there's one other hero alongside Moses that we remember, it's Joshua, his sidekick, his understudy, and he's going to be the one who will take Moses' place when Moses eventually dies. But there are actually 3 great leaders in the Exodus and the conquest, and the third one is the one who never held any political office. He never was the general over the army. He's the guy that really lived in the shadows, and his name was Caleb. We never hear of Caleb until God has done the 10 big plagues and has miraculously set His people free, and they've gone to take possession of the land that He's been promising for hundreds of years to the descendants of Abraham. And as they've left, you remember the whole deal of how they're pursued by Pharaoh and his army, and they cross the Red Sea miraculously, and God destroys the army of Pharaoh there in the Red Sea. And so now finally they're free. They've gotten past the reach of Egypt, and now they're just in the wilderness. They're in the desert of the Sinai Peninsula, and in that first year a lot of important things happen, the giving of the law and the 10 commandments. But after they've been free for about a year, and they're still in the Sinai Peninsula, they've made their way over to the eastern edge of the Sinai Peninsula. They're about 100 miles south of the heart of the Holy Land that they were called to go in and take possession of. And in Numbers chapter 13, if you want to turn with me in your Bibles, I've given most of this to you in your notes, but we're going to be in Numbers 13 and 14, and then we're going to be in Joshua 14. We pick up in the story about 1 year into the Exodus as God's people are going to claim what God has for them. And they've come to a place called Kadesh Barnea, about 100 miles from the heart of their destination. And God says to His people at the very beginning of Numbers 13, He says to Moses, I want you to pick out from the 12 different tribes one person to represent each tribe, one man, and I want you to send those 12 north up into the land that I've promised to you, and I want them to scout the land for you and come back and give a report. That was a big deal because they didn't have Google Earth to check out where they're going. and as slaves, they hadn't vacationed up into the Holy Land. So somebody needed to go and lay eyes on this land that they were going to go possess. So Moses, he picked these 12 men, and among those 12, we have all 12 names, but 10 of them you would not recognize because they are so unimportant in history. 2 of them you would recognize. 2 of the 12 were Joshua and Caleb. Caleb representing the tribe of Judah. And to those 12, he said, you go up and you thoroughly scout out the land. I want you to see what the people are like. See what the cities are like. Are they walled? Are they fortified? Are there armies there? See what the crops look like. See what the land is like. We want to know everything about that. And then you come back and we'll prepare to go in and take the land. And so Joshua, Caleb, and 10 other spies headed north into the Holy Land. They were scouting out not just what is Israel today, but out on up into southern Lebanon and into the western part of Jordan and the southwestern part of Syria, because the Holy Land in Old Testament times was bigger than modern Israel is. And they spent 40 days just crisscrossing through that territory, checking it all out. And then they came back south and they met up with the whole gigantic encampment. And they went to Moses and they gave their report in Numbers chapter 13. And you'll see in your outline just a brief version of the report that they gave. And beginning in verse 27, they gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit, because he had said, bring back some of the produce from the land for us to see. And it says that the land was so abundant that they literally, in bringing back a cluster of grapes, had to put it on a pole between 2 men's shoulders to let it hang down so it didn't drag the ground. They're just bringing back all these examples of the great fruit there. But the people who live there, they said, are powerful. And their cities are fortified and very large. And we even saw the descendants of Anak there. Now we read that and go, what's the big deal about that? Well, it's actually the statement that would strike as much fear in the hearts of the people as anything that they could possibly say. They're saying, hey, it's a great land. It's an abundant land. There are cities there, just as God said there would be. But understand, we're not going to be able to take this land. We don't have an army. We don't have weapons of war. We're not going to be able to sack fortified cities. But hey, worst of all, while we were there, we saw with our own eyes the people that we've heard about all of our lives. We saw the giants. We saw the descendants of Anak. Now, I'm going to take just a moment to take a little side trail and chase this rabbit for just a minute, because this actually becomes significant a little bit later in the story today. Who are these descendants of Anak? We don't know exactly who they are, but if you want to just follow with me for a moment, if you were to look back in Genesis chapter 6, because Moses goes on to clarify in verse 33, when they're explaining who it was that they saw, these giants. In Numbers 13:33, he says, we saw the Nephilim, the descendants of Anak. They come from Nephilim, and we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. You get what they're saying? These guys are so huge, we felt like little grasshoppers next to them. These guys are genetic super freaks. They would be if they were alive today, they would be the NBA All-Stars. They would be Pro Bowlers every year in the NFL. These would make our best athletes look a little bit girly. Genesis chapter 6 gives us this little vague description of who these people are descended from. And this is one of the greatest mysteries of the Old Testament. This will leave some of you scratching your heads if you're not familiar with this. But about a little over 4,500 years ago, something happened. We're not completely sure, but something strange happened, out of which genetic, just almost superhumans emerged, a small group of them, just before the flood. And in Genesis 6:4, the final verse on this group of people, it says this: the Nephilim, that's from whom the descendants of Anak come, they were on the earth in those days and also afterwards, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, the men of renown. Scholars have debated and struggled and scratched their heads over this. They're referred to again and again in the Old Testament. The Nephilim, the sons of Anak. Who and what are they? Moses simply sums it up in Genesis 6 by saying, they were the result of when the sons of God came down and cohabited with the daughters of men, and some superhuman freaks emerged from that. Well, the most commonly held theory about this, and this is going to sound really weird, but it is the most common theory, is that there were certain angels, fallen angels, demons, who actually mated with human women, and out of that, humans that were bigger and stronger than other humans emerged. Nobody knows for sure. So some of the people who believe that that's what this scripture is describing believe that those demons were placed in prison by God. Peter refers to this in his epistle in the New Testament, speaking of those spirits who no longer are free to roam on the earth, that God has gone ahead and He already locked them away until the final judgment. Some theorize that that's because they did something, they crossed a line that nobody else had ever crossed, and God said, you're not even going to get to roam free temporarily, you're being locked away. We really don't know. Peter just says that they're there, that there are spirits already in prison. Other people think that this is a description of just some kind of genetic anomaly that happened when the sons of God were actually the godly line that were the descendants of Seth, when they made it up with certain pagan groups, that the Nephilim emerged from that. We don't know the answer to that. It really doesn't matter what the answer to that is. The bottom line is simply this, and it will matter a whole lot in just a little bit in the story. There are some people who live in one particular part of the Holy Land, and they are scary beyond words. There really isn't any group on earth today that we can point to and say, they're like them. It's just, for all intents and purposes, it is the Jolly Green Giants of the Holy Land. We have seen them with our eyes, and they come back and say, there's no way we could conquer those people. Well, as this bad report is being given, it gets interrupted by Caleb in verse 30. Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land that they had explored. Well, all of this is happening on the day that the spies have come back and they're giving their report to Moses. And now there's this division, 10 giving a bad report and 2 giving a report saying, let's go do it. And the 10 are like, listen, we can't just let Moses and Joshua and Caleb rule the day here. We've got to spread the word among the people so that they won't follow them in this. And so as you pick up in the beginning of Numbers 14, it says, so then that night all of the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, if only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. A mutiny is happening. They are going to hijack the leadership from Moses and from Joshua. But Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes, and they said to the entire Israelite assembly, the land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, He will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and He will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord. And do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. You see, just earlier in the evening, the people had said, that land and those people will devour us. And Caleb and Joshua stand up and say, no, we will devour them, for their protection is gone. But the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. Now, we're hoping that everybody's going to go, yeah, that's right, let's do that. But in the very next verse it says, but the whole assembly talked about stoning them. Boy, there's a lesson in that. When you speak up and stand up for what God says, and when it goes against the grain of the culture, look out, because people want to have your head. The first thing about Caleb that stands out to me is that Caleb stood apart, because Caleb was far more concerned with the words of God than with the opinions of men. You may say, what's the deal about being concerned with the words of God? Well, Caleb had seen all the other things that the 10 spies had seen. He saw the fortified cities and the armies and all, the big giants. But Caleb wasn't nearly as concerned with that as he was with what God had said about this. What had God said about this? Well, a year or two before, when God spoke to Moses in the land of Midian and said, I've heard the cries of my people, and I'm now acting to do something about that. In Exodus 3:8, speaking from the burning bush, he says, so I've come down to rescue them from the land of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. I'm going to give them that land, and he says, I'm going to give them cities that they didn't build and let them harvest crops that they didn't plant. When in the beginning of Numbers 13, whenever he said, I want you to go up and scout the land, he says, scout the land because I'm about to give it to you. Well, that's all that really mattered in Caleb's mind. When he went and scouted the land, it wasn't to see if they could take it. He went to scout and see what they were about to get. Because he wasn't looking at it through the eyes of just the natural to say, can we do it? No, he already had ringing in his ears the words of the Lord. And the Lord had said, I'm giving you this. So with every new hill and every new bend that they went around, Caleb's going, oh yeah, and we get that? Whoo, and we get that city too. Man, look at that farm. We're going to eat well, aren't we? That's going to be ours. While these other guys are looking and going, oh my, we could never take that city. We could never conquer those people. Because the 10 were living in a mindset that dominates how many of us think. And it could be summed up with the statement that facts without faith equals despair. I want you to say that one with me. Facts without faith equals despair. Don't you know that's the truth? Now, the 10 spies, let me ask you this. Were they crazy and off base in their evaluation of the land? Do you think? In the natural, were they? Not at all. I mean, the report that they gave from a flesh and blood perspective was an accurate report. Great land, beautiful crops. I mean, it is, by the way, if you haven't ever visited Israel, boy, there are parts of it even today, even though it's not as lush as it used to be. It is an amazing land. The fertile parts of that area and the climate that they have, they're able to plant 2 crops per year. They get 2 full growing seasons per year. I mean, it is a land of abundance. If you go there today, you'll see these vast banana orchards and olive orchards and date palms all over. It really is a lush land, and they're describing a beautiful, lush place. But think about it. They are a ragtag bunch of people. They've got children, they've got senior adults, they have no army, they don't have any chariots, they don't have weapons of war, and they're supposed to march in to a very much occupied and populated section of the world with walled cities all over the place. Now you tell me, how are all of these people who've never been trained in the art of warfare and they don't have weapons, how are you going to breach huge walled cities? I mean, Jericho, for instance, we know was surrounded by a wall that was so thick that chariots rode around on top of the wall. We're not talking about like a single brick wall. We're talking about Great Wall of China kind of depth to that wall surrounding that city. How's just a group of people like that going to sack a city like this? From a flesh and blood perspective, from the eyes of just the facts, there's no way to do it. And when all you have are the facts, in many situations, it's going to leave you at a point of fear and despair, isn't it? Because here's what the facts will often tell you. This sickness will probably end in death. This illness, this tumor, oftentimes can't be treated by doctors. The facts may tell you this financial hole that you've gotten into, you'll never get out of. You'll never recover from that bankruptcy. You'll never recover the situation on your house or having lost your house. The facts will tell you you've lost your kids. You've lost your child. They've gone off the deep end. They've gotten sucked into an unhealthy relationship. Their life is suddenly being controlled by booze or pills or sex. You've lost your child. And the facts would seem to indicate that that's right, because facts without faith just leaves you in despair. But Caleb modeled the reverse of that for us. Because we aren't a people who just see the facts in the natural. Caleb says the thing that really determines this is not what we see, it's what we hear from God. And I've got a word from God, and God said, that land, it is such an amazing land. It is as though it flows with milk and honey. There is such an abundance there, and I am giving it to you. Go scout out and see what I'm giving you. So at every point along the way, it didn't matter how big and bad the people looked or how tall the walled cities are. Caleb is going, oh yeah, this is going to be good. Wait and see what God is about to do, because Caleb was more concerned with what God said than what the rest of the people thought. And that's what sets real people of faith apart. That's what sets real difference makers apart, is having heard what God says about the really big challenges of life. Now, here's the question that I want you to consider, and we're going to come back to it at the end. What challenge, what obstacle, what difficulty are you facing, stressing over, trying to deal with in life that in the natural it doesn't look good? That in the natural you don't see progress. In the natural, you don't see a happy outcome to this. What's the situation in life that for you, in the eyes of the flesh, would just leave you at the point of despair and throwing up your hands and going, this is not going to turn out well? And the real question is, what is God saying about that situation? We'll come back to that. The second thing about Caleb that stands out in this story, and I'm just going to tell you, this is the part I don't like, but it's important. Caleb spent decades faithfully waiting on God's timing. Now, what we just read about happened about a year after they came out of Egypt. If you know the story of the Exodus, you know the next 40 years are not happy years. The people, by the way, didn't stone, obviously, Joshua, Caleb, and Moses because God intervened. God was mad. You know God gets mad? It's not a happy thing when God is mad. God was mad enough to kill some people. I said you don't remember the names of the other 10 spies. If you remember the names of the other 10 spies, you are like Bible super genius, and you need to take my place, because I can't name any of them, in large part because God immediately killed the other 10. God was so angry that these 10 and their report that was just devoid of faith and how it discouraged his people, he immediately sent a plague and just wiped out those 10 on the spot. And so the people are kind of freaked out now, and they're like, oh, I think maybe we've messed up. Maybe we should have gone in and taken the land like God said to. Let's go take it. Well, it was too late. God was so angry, he said, I'm not going to let any of these people go in and experience the land that I've prepared for them. I'm going to let all of them die in the desert. And he said, for every day of the 40 days that you went and explored the land, for every one of those days, I'm going to make those people spend a year wandering in the wilderness. The irony is, they were only about 100 miles from the land that God was giving to them. They could have gotten there in about a week's time or a little more, just walking. And God said, nope, I'm going to make them spend 40 years wandering around in this wilderness until every last one of them dies. Everybody over the age of 20, I'm going to kill off in the wilderness over the next 40 years. The only two that I'm going to leave alive to go into the land who are over the age of 20 are going to be the two faithful spies, Joshua and Caleb. The others, they're going to die off, and it'll be their children and their grandchildren who get into the land. And so in Numbers 14, God says, not one of them will ever see the land that I promised on oath to their ancestors. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it. But because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land that he went into, and his descendants will inherit it. And so now, we jump ahead 45 years in time. If you've got your Bibles, flip over to Joshua chapter 14. They do indeed wander for 40 years in the wilderness, and it is not a happy season. God is teaching them to become a people. They had just been this really random group in bondage. And now, when we get to Joshua 14, We've finished the 40 years of wandering. At the beginning of Joshua, they get to the edge of the Holy Land. Moses is able to look over and see it before he dies at the ripe old age of 120. And then Joshua takes his place. And for the next 5 years, Joshua leads the people. He is now the commander of the whole nation. And he leads them in battle after battle after battle, victory after victory, as they go in and city by city, they claim the Holy Land. And where we pick up the story now in Joshua chapter 14, for 45 years, Caleb has just sort of lived in the shadows in terms of the story that's recorded in Scripture. I'm sure he's been a part of these battles along the way, but he's not large and in charge. He's not famous. He's just faithfully believing God, trusting God for what has been promised to him. So now he's endured 40 years in the wilderness and 5 years of fighting to take the land that has been promised to them. And he's still waiting for the promise that God has given to him personally. And so in Joshua 14:6, it says, "Now the men of Judah approached Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, said to him, 'You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, at Kadesh Barnea about you and me.'" Remember Kadesh Barnea back on the Sinai 45 years ago. "You remember what he said about you and me?" And Caleb says, "I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land. And I brought him back a report according to my convictions." That's an important line, isn't it? That's how Caleb operated. He operated according to his convictions. Boy, there's a question worth asking. What are your convictions that you hold so strongly that you really live your life wrapped around them? He said, "I gave my report according to my convictions, but my brothers who went up with me, they made the hearts of the people melt with fear. I, however, followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. So on that day Moses swore to me, 'The land on which your feet have walked will be your inheritance and that of your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly.'" And he goes on to say, "Now then, just as the Lord promised, he has kept me alive for 45 years since the time he said this to Moses while Israel moved about in the desert. So here I am today, 85 years old." 45 years. Caleb has been faithfully waiting and watching and trusting God to fulfill his promise. I told you this is the part I don't like, but this is a key part in being greatly used of God. You have to be willing to wait. There are things that God will do in your life that happen quickly. There will be times where God speaks, you pray, and God moves immediately. Sometimes it will happen literally in the moment. Sometimes it will happen the same day. But sometimes you're going to have to wait. Sometimes that wait can be weeks or months, but there are some things that really matter that you will spend years and sometimes decades of your life waiting for God to move. This is such a critical piece, because understand what God is doing, He is doing on a grand scale. He is personally involved in your life and in your circumstances, but He is not singularly involved in your life and my life. He has a big picture that He's working out, and your life, your family, your circumstances tie into that big picture. And God is willing to take as much time as is necessary to work out His plan. So when God speaks on a situation, and you get excited and you start praying and believing for that to happen, don't you grow faint. Don't grow weary and lose heart, because a month has passed, 6 months have passed, a year has passed, 2 years have passed, and it hasn't happened yet. The truth of the matter is, there are a bunch of us in this room who have had some really significant things that have been on our hearts, and we've been praying, and we have really been believing God for, and many of us know that God has spoken. God has opened our eyes to just catch a glimpse of what it is that He wants to do and plans to do. But with the passing of time, some of us have just begun to think, I must have been wrong. Maybe that was just wishful thinking on my part. Maybe that was just my imagination, hoping that God would do this thing, but I guess my prayers aren't working. I guess I don't have enough faith. I guess maybe God isn't going to do this. Don't you let doubt creep in and steal away what God has said He's going to do with you, with your life, with your family, because what God has said He will bring to pass. A big part of why Caleb winds up being greatly used of God is because he was willing to wait as long as it took. One of the most surprising things to me when I read particularly the Old Testament is how many of the people that God used in a big way, we don't know about anything big happening in their lives until they were old. No offense to those of you who are older than me, but I mean, some of these guys were just flat out old. Well, Abraham was really old. And Caleb's pretty much on up there. I mean, 85 years, that's pretty stout. There are a lot of people that they had to believe God and wait a long time before they saw what God had promised come to pass. And that brings us to the final thing that I'll say about Caleb, and it is this. As Caleb got older, he grew even bolder. Now that really is an important truth for us. Caleb is way into the senior adult life. Think about it. He is one of the 2 oldest men in the entire country. There's nobody else in the entire nation over the age of 65 because God killed all of them off. Caleb and Joshua, Caleb's 85 and Joshua's nearly the same age. Everybody else is 20 years their junior or younger. You would think at this point it's time to slow down. It's time to, find a nice place on the beach in Fairhope and retire, right? Time to back it off. No. As Caleb got older, he just got way bolder. Let me hear you say that. Older and bolder. Older and bolder. That needs to become the motto of many of our lives. Older and bolder. I'm not going to slow down when I get older. I'm just going to get bolder. Listen to the story and see if I'm exaggerating. Let's pick up where we left off in Joshua 14, verse 10. Caleb speaking. Now then, just as the Lord promised, He has kept me alive for 45 years since the time He said this to Moses, while Israel moved about in the wilderness. So here I am today, 85 years old, and I'm still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I'm just as vigorous to go out to battle now as I was then. Now give me this hill country that the Lord promised me that day. You yourselves heard that the Anakites were there and that their cities were large and fortified, but the Lord helping me, I will drive them out just as He said. You see, if you read the whole story carefully, what you'll find out is, as the Israelites went in and took possession of the land, they took most of the cities, but right in the heart of the land, there were some cities that they didn't take for a couple of reasons. They were heavily fortified and they sat in the hill country. Any military position or city that is set on a hill is the most difficult thing you can ever have to take in battle, because you're having to go uphill and it's just, you're totally exposed and it's virtually impossible to pull off. That was part of what was stacked against the Israelites, but the other thing is, that's where the descendants of Anak lived. This is where those super freaks descended from the Nephilim lived. And even though they had spent 5 years, God giving them miraculous victory one after another, they just bypassed that whole region. We'll get back to that someday. And after 5 years of taking cities and the war is about to be done, Caleb steps up to Joshua and says, hey man, I just want to remind you of something. 45 years ago, whenever God sent us into this land, I spoke out of conviction. I was ready to serve the Lord wholeheartedly, and our people shrunk back in fear because of the lousy report of the other 10 spies. But I've been believing God all of this time. Now we've been skipping this territory right here. Nobody wants to fight for that. Everybody's afraid of the people who live there. And Joshua, I just want to tell you, I'm believing God for what He's promised. And here's what I want you to know today. At 85, I ain't backing off. In fact, I'm ramping up. So I want you, Joshua, to turn me loose. I want to go against the baddest of them all. So you send me in. I want the hill country. Bring on the giants. I'm ready at 85. And Joshua goes, well, have at 'em, big boy. Just go on. I'm pretty fired up reading that. I mean, I want to join in with Caleb and his band. How's this going to turn out? Well, in Joshua 15, it says, From Hebron, Caleb drove out the Anakites. Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai. These names don't mean anything to us today, but boy, in their day, they're like, holy smoke, those were the Hulk Hogans of the crowd. Those were the baddest of the bad, the sons of Anak. And from there, he marched against the people living in Debir, the whole surrounding region. So Hebron has belonged to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, ever since, because he followed the Lord, the God of Israel, wholeheartedly. Hebron used to be called Kiriath Arba, after Arba, who was the greatest man among the Anakites. That's just a great little parenthetical line. We don't know. I mean, you know, if somebody said today, you ever been to Kiriath Arba? Nobody today would have a clue. It's like, where is that? It doesn't exist anymore. It has a new name. It used to be named for the baddest giant among the giants. After Caleb got done with it, they had to give it a new name, because Arba is dead and this city don't belong to him anymore. We'll call it Hebron from now on. Well, everybody's heard of Hebron. It's one of the most significant cities in all the Holy Land today. Nobody calls it Arba. We all call it Hebron because it was a land, it was a city that was set free by Caleb and those who followed him. As Caleb got older, Caleb got bolder. And that better define how you and I think and operate. The church today is not operating on all 8 cylinders, and part of the reason for that is because we have adopted a mindset in the church that looks a lot like our careers. It's like, you know, as I move toward my 60s, I'm hoping for retirement and can kind of slow down and operate at a different pace of life. Hey, that's great if that works in your career. That does not apply to your life spiritually. Because it is God's plan and design that the greatest warriors in this body would be the oldest men and women in the body. Because time and experience and walking with God is growing your faith so that you should be the one leading the charge. And whether you're 85 or 75 or 65, if you've got some years of walking with the Lord, you ought to be leading the charge. Don't you dare back down. When I moved to Fairhope in 1998, I really didn't know but 2 people in the whole town, and then God immediately moved them away to Tuscaloosa, so I didn't know anybody when we moved here. But God, just by His design, let me meet and come to know a gentleman who was in his 70s. Well, I'll just call him Pastor Jim. That's his first name. He was a retired pastor who had, God had used him in some really big ways to reach a lot of people, and he had, you know, eventually done what folks will do. He had retired and moved to beautiful Fairhope, and he was still trying to serve the Lord, but and was serving the Lord, but just trying to find his place in serving the Lord. And the Lord just made it real clear to me, hey, this is a guy you need to get to know. And so I went to him and just asked him. I'm like, hey, I'm a young minister, 29 years old, and I would love to learn from you everything that I could if you'd be willing to give me any of your time. And he agreed and said, hey, if you'll come to my house this time every week, we'll just do stuff together. So 2 hours a week for a long season of time, he just let me come over and just learn from him. And it was amazing the stuff that he had to give away. And after we had been doing that for more than a year, he shared with me that the pastor who at the time pastored the largest Baptist church in America in Houston, Texas, had contacted him and said, we're about to undertake something like what we've never done before. This was on the leading edge of the whole multi-campus movement that's been sweeping across the country. He said, we're about to try planning a second campus for the first time. And we just really believe God's calling us to do this on a big scale. It's in one of the largest cities in America, and we're going to really try and reach a lot of people. I mean, this is one of those things, it started out with thousands, the new campus did. And he said, if we're going to do this, I need you to come out of retirement and come in and lead the way in this. And when he shared this with me, honestly, I'm just admitting my faulty thinking at the time. I'm thinking, well, that's crazy. What's this pastor thinking? I mean, he's taking this guy in his mid-70s who's, you know, kind of gotten into retirement life here and is asking him to move to Texas and be the point man in leading this ministry to thousands of people. It's going to be a gigantic task. Going to do this meeting in a public school, for heaven's sake. Just a lot of labor involved in that. And I'm like, well, that just sounds crazy. And I'm thinking to myself, surely that's not going to happen. I mean to tell you, in a flash, that whole deal was put together, and they packed up everything they owned, sold their house, left town, and moved to Houston. And that was the person that they installed to lead in this new work, which did take off and reach thousands of people. Now, I felt a great sense of loss in that, because my new good friend who had meant so much to me, was suddenly removed. But man, I just couldn't help but respect and admire as the years passed to see, boy, God used this man in a significant way. And thankfully, that much younger pastor in this gigantic church had the wisdom to realize, hey, we're about to need to take a city set on a hill. We're about to have to try and do something that not many have done. I better get a seasoned man who is full of faith to lead the charge. And he called out of retirement somebody in his mid-70s to go do it. I share that story just to say, this isn't just a Bible thing. This is a here and now thing. Don't you think that with the passing of time that you're winding down. That is not how it works in the kingdom. With the passing of time, God is ramping up. He is making bigger assignments, more significant assignments that would only fit with a heart that is more mature and more full of faith. As you get bolder, as you get older, make sure you get bolder. Be willing to tackle the big stuff. Don't dare back down and let yourself become a Sunday morning spectator, because I promise you, if you're a follower of Jesus and you belong to the kingdom, God is ramping you up for the next thing that He wants to do. And young people, nothing against any of you or any of us. I'm somewhere in between. As we get older, God's going to give us bigger assignments. Caleb is a great picture of that. Now, as we wrap up, there really are two questions that I want you to consider. Go back to what I asked you before. What is the hill country for you? What is that was the big obstacle that nobody wanted to tackle. It was the thing that seemed impossible. When you think today, July 2015, there's something in your life that matters to you, weighs on your heart, comes back to your mind again and again. And it just seems like a big obstacle to overcome. It may be a personal struggle, but for many of us, it's not necessarily about a personal struggle that you're dealing with. It just may be an issue in your family or with one of your kids, somebody surrounding you that you care about. And you just don't know how that's going to happen. You can't see how that's going to happen. And then the next question is, what has God said He wants to do in that situation? What is the Word of God for that situation? Would you bow with me as we go to the Lord together in prayer? Father, Your Word is faithful and true. And I thank You that You have filled the pages of Scripture with the powerful stories of men and women who have followed You and that You've chosen to use in significant ways. Thank You for the life of Caleb. And I pray, God, that by the work of Your Spirit, that You would raise up some Calebs among us, men and women of faith who follow You wholeheartedly and who act out of conviction. I ask You the question, what has God said to you about the biggest obstacle, the biggest challenge, maybe the biggest test of your faith that you're dealing with right now? It may be that thing that you've prayed about for months or years and you've lost faith over. Maybe you've given up on. What is that thing, and what has God said about that? And for many of us, there's probably a sense of, I don't know what God said about it. I know what I want God to do. I know what I ask God to do. But this is the heart of faith being birthed for us. Have you heard what God says about that? And if you haven't, you really need to. So I want you to just do a real practical thing right now. Whether you're watching and listening online or here in the room, I want you to just pray a simple prayer of faith. God, would you speak to my heart, and would you show me what it is that you have to say about this situation? Would you show me what it is that you want to do, that you plan to do? And would you just sit quietly and listen for what he says? Sometimes God's going to speak in a verbal form, but oftentimes He'll speak by giving you a picture, an image. Sometimes He'll speak by giving you a symbol. And if some of that has popped in your mind, if there's been a picture that's popped in your head, something symbolic, and maybe you don't immediately recognize what that is, just ask Him for clarity. Lord, help me to understand what you're showing me.